The film in which you are about to see is an account of the disaster in which befell 13 West Virginian coal miners. Out of all the countries in the world, the US is ranked number 3 when it comes to coal production, only behind China and India. And in the states themselves, West Virginia is ranked number 2, right behind Wyoming. And because of this, they have a very close-knit mining community. So on January 2nd, 2006, many of the miners had just gotten back from vacation with their families and were actually quite eager to get back to work inside Sago Mine. The mine itself is located in Sago, West Virginia, which is about an hour away from Charleston, which is the capital of West Virginia. Unfortunately though, the mine itself has a very long laundry list of violations and complaints in the past prior to the accident, with even a record 208 violations in the year of 2005 alone, which is the very year prior to this accident. The mine would open up for operations at about 6 a.m., and the mine fire boss conducted his safety examinations at approximately 5:50 a.m. And with everything deemed safe for the operations, 2 groups of men made their way down the mine in carts towards the deepest sections of the cave, which is located right here and here. The second crew was traveling about 10 minutes behind the first crew, which was heading to a section called 1 Left, while the lead cart was heading to a section called 2 Left, which were both located right here. On the way down, many of the men were excited, but also naturally worried, as mining in general is a very dangerous and surprising job where anything could go wrong. So many were also notably quiet and a little nervous, not to mention nearby is a recently closed section of the mine that just very recently filled to the brim with very natural occurring methane gas, which as we all know is highly flammable and can be highly explosive. Just outside though, something very bad was beginning to brew, something that would change the course of the entire day and the rest of their lives. It was a thunderstorm and it was beginning to engulf the entire town. But even more than that, the workers up top start to notice how volatile the lightning is starting to look, but try to pay it no mind as it still looks a good enough distance away. As soon as the second cart of men had made it to their turning point to get to 1 Left, they would then hear an enormous boom that was then followed by a massive rush of rocks and dirt. Luckily though, without thinking, many of the men decided to duck their heads and brace for the impact. As one of the men remembers even thinking, "All you felt was a sudden rush of heat, rocks, and coal. I thought we were already dead." As soon as the avalanche of debris was done falling, they all started to look around to make sure everyone was okay. Though since it had hit so hard and fast, no one could even put together what might have actually happened, or the actual danger and situation that they were actually in. That was until someone yelled out, "The mine just exploded. I think we're trapped." And even furthermore, unfortunately for the miners, thick smoke quickly started to fill the room that they were in, followed slowly by something much deadlier. The deadly methane gas from the other room. And so without hesitation, Owen Jones began to lead everyone that was in the second crew into another corridor that was nearby with fresh air. Once they got to an area that had a lot of cleaner air, they started to try and communicate with the group of men that were in the lead cart. Since unfortunately these men were already in 2 Left corridor when the explosion hit. Owen Jones was particularly worried about the first crew though, as his brother Jesse Jones had descended into the mine before him and was part of the first crew of miners. Unfortunately though, unable to go any further into the mine, they had to follow procedure and start to go towards the entrance, which was relatively easy for them now since the blast area was now behind them. As soon as the second group reached the entrance, they were treated for any injuries that they had, and were also told that they already had a rescue team on the way for the first group. Although, because of the proximity of the mine and equipment needed for the rescue, they were told that they wouldn't be there for another 3 hours. So, feeling helpless, the men were notably frustrated. Meanwhile, hundreds of feet down, the 12 men are okay, though notably shaken up. Most of them don't fully understand what just happened, and so they decide to try to first ride the cart back to the top. But of course, their path was fully blocked by rocks and debris now. Surprisingly though, there is enough room for them to walk and squeeze around the rocks and rubble. But because of the incredibly thick smoke that had just filled the corridor earlier, making their visibility to an almost zero, so they couldn't see any other way to get around it and turn around to see if there was another way out. And lucky enough, each man had a special kind of mask with them known as a self-rescuer that helps them breathe in methane-thick oxygen. though these units are not perfect and only provide a limited amount of air supply to breathe. So because of this, their minds started playing tricks on them, which made a few of the men start to believe that they weren't getting enough air to breathe and started to panic. And even worse than that, about 4 of the self-rescuers started to malfunction, altogether meaning that traveling through the rest of the mine might be impossible to do due to the poison and thick lung-constricting smoke. Back up top, the mine's main staff office was trying desperately to get in contact with the first crew that were still stuck in the mine. So much so that the second crew remembers seeing them yelling in the office, trying in vain, as the first crew's line of communications were knocked out during the main blast. So there was nothing that they could do to contact them, though they still tried. A little later, they would send their first rescue attempt in to try and find the men, though because professional rescue crew members were still not available, Owen Jones and the other miners would try to find his brother and the other miners that were trapped. Unfortunately though, they quickly ran into more thick smoke and poisonous gases, forcing them to stop only 1,900 feet or 570 meters from their trapped friends, before having to turn back around and head towards the entrance. 1 hour has now passed since the explosion, and many of the family members of the miners have started to pile in to a local church. And many were already hoping that hopefully their loved ones would already be free by the time that they were there. But as time went on, the truth would unfortunately reveal itself. Fortunately though, the first crew is still alive, though at this time, since they aren't able to find another way out, are forced to barricade themselves. Which only unfortunately means that they gave up on trying to find a way out on their own, and are now totally reliant on someone trying to find them. As they waited, they set up tarps to slow down the deadly gas from creeping into their area. They would also share each other's air supply and the remaining working self-rescuers. Meanwhile, back up top, after 5 long hours, the professional rescue team finally starts to show up around 11 a.m. Unfortunately though, federal and state officials had already taken over operations by this time, and denied anyone access into the mine until the levels of the deadly gas were down, as they were afraid of another explosion happening, leading to further people dying or trapped into the mine. Meanwhile, down inside the mine, the men were doing everything they were trained to do in order to stay alive. One of those things was to hit the rough bolts up ahead on the roof in order to signal and let the rescuers know where they were. Unfortunately though, the specialized equipment needed to hear thumps that low was left in Pittsburgh due to the government believing that it would take too long to set up. So after a few hours of doing this and no response, the men would give up and begin to write notes to their loved ones, just in case the worst would happen. And then finally, at 5 p.m., almost 11 hours after the explosion, federal officials finally give the okay for the rescue personnel to start their descent. Not knowing exactly where the men are, they proceed with caution, very slowly checking every single chamber and corridor just in case the men decided to move from their initial 2 left corridor. Meanwhile, back on the surface, the remaining rescuers decided they were going to also drill a large hole in the ground directly over the 2 left corridor in order to reach the trapped men, just in case the other rescuers can't reach them in time. Surprisingly, it breaks through around 3 or 4 a.m., but there are no signs of the trapped men below. They then test the air down below in the corridor to see just how poor it actually was, though it came back that it was too poor to sustain any life at all. And despite the grim news, they decided to keep hope alive that the initial rescue team would find them alive. Due to how slowly they were searching the mine though, it wouldn't be until the next day around 5 p.m. that they would actually finally find the initial cave-in area almost 2 miles or 3 kilometers underground. And it would be there that one of the rescuers would see a pair of feet dangling out of the rocks. Unfortunately, it was Fire Boss Terry Helms, who wasn't with the trap crew, but was performing safety checks when the explosion happened, and was almost certainly killed immediately from the blast. They then managed to send his remains back up top and kept moving. Then, using specialized equipment, the rescue team would set up a clean air room and get ready to embark even further. In order to make it a little easier and faster though, they only sent forward a 6-man team to go the rest of the way, while the rest stayed back in the clean air room just in case they needed the backup. The 6 men then proceeded to the end of the 2 left corridor. As they were walking, they saw the broken self-rescuers that the miners had left behind from earlier. They knew that they were getting closer. As the rescuers got closer, one of them heard a moan coming from ahead. So they ran to see if the men were still alive. One of the men, not thinking, was so excited that they thought that they found the men that before actually checking to see if they were still alive, screamed through his walkie-talkie that they were over here and they're alive. Instinctively, but without thinking, the chain of command back up top relays the joyful news to everyone, including the friends and family who were waiting eagerly for kind news. But sadly, the reality was that all but one Randall McCloy Jr. had all succumbed to the methane gas and were all dead. Unfortunately though, with the men so deep underground and their communication lines already stretched so thin, no one would know their actual fate until much later. The rescuers would then work desperately to try to save Randall, who was by this time hanging by a thread. Luckily though, they were able to get him to the fresh air room, where they then sent him up in a cart back to the entrance, where he then received immediate medical help. Once he gets back up to the top though, it becomes clear to all the staff members that no one else is coming back out of this mine alive. Not wanting to let the families know of the fate of their loved ones just yet though, they send a small team of doctors down the mine to confirm the deaths. And now, unfortunately, 3 hours after the crew was initially discovered, at 2:45 a.m., Ben Hatfield, who was in charge of the mining company, arrived at the church to let them know. And unfortunately, the families, once thinking that their loved ones were okay, were now in disbelief and heartbreak when they learned the fate of the rest of the miners. A few days later, Randall would write about what happened, stating, "Some fell into a deep sleep, and I remember Jackie Weaver telling me that if it was our time to go, then God's will be fulfilled." Thomas Anderson, Alva Bennett, James Bennett, Jerry Groves, George Hamner, Terry Helms, Jesse Jones, David Lewis, Martin Toller Jr., Fred Ware, Jackie Weaver, and Marshall Winans. These were all just your average hard-working Americans who were just trying to put food on the table with hard, honest work, but unfortunately found themselves in an impossible situation. Let me know in the comments what would you have done if you were a coal miner and found yourself trapped in the bottom of an impossible mine. Thank you all again for watching. Remember to hit the like and subscribe buttons and turn on the notification bell for more content in the future. Goodbye for now.